I must speed up. To come to the 19th century, there were still 30 boats and 60-odd fishermen recorded in the early 19th century. And as we go to the late 19th century, all of that is reinforced, as most of you know probably, by the establishment of our own fantastic boat building emporium down here on the site of the present chip shop. The boat builder that everybody knows of was Dick Pill. I think his father set up the boat building business in the first place. Now, those boats were fabulous boats. They were called model boats, and not without reason. They were favoured all over the country, particularly on the east coast of England. East coast fishermen preferred a Dick Pill boat above all others. We're also fortunate in having 4 surviving Dick Pill boats in the village. I think it's 4, there may be more. If I miss anything out, forgive me. But we've got the Izmir, owned by David Collier, the Cotswold, owned by Jeff Fox, the Coral Reef, owned by Glenn Dutton, and the Albion, owned by John Gray Smith. Nice to see her on the water sometime. But they are a wonderful heritage, and I mean all credit to those owners, seriously, for keeping those marvellous vessels in the village. I mean, they make the harbour if you're looking for aesthetic pleasure. 20th century, the pilchard shoals changed their patterns, their migration patterns. Or possibly, as the same fishermen alleged, the practice of drifting for pilchards broke up the shoals. Pilchard drifters would be out deeper in the bays around, and they would shoot up to 7, 8, 9 miles of nets in a great wall. And you can imagine that something like that might have a disruptive effect on that particular species. And so the pilchard fishery declined. But even before it declined, crabbing had begun. How do we know this? Well, there's one little documentary bit that probably all guess that fishermen around here supplemented their income with the odd bit of contraband, and that would be the subject for another evening, smuggling in Garnhaven. But apparently, even in the 19th century, the French used to come over here, haul up the Garnhaven men's crab pots, stick the contraband into it for the Garnhaven men to haul and bring ashore later. That was documented, which means that crabbing was going on in the 19th century, and it certainly took over in the 20th. And there were quite a lot of boats here, you know, in the early 20th century, all of it interrupted by wars, but things were sufficiently prosperous in the 1930s for the Fishermen's Cooperative Society to be formed, and the fishermen acquired an old Napier lorry. I think you can still see the axle of it over the back of the quay where some naughty people dumped it. But anyway, they had a lorry, they took the fish up to Billingsgate twice a week. In the first place, the Mermaid was the weighing and packing house. Then where the doctor's surgery is now, that for a time was the weighing and packing house. And then in the fullness of time, Tony's shop, the garage opposite the chip shop, was used, although that gets a bit complicated, but so I won't go into it. And it appears that there was some resurgence after the war as well. But then economic changes, social changes, higher aspirations, and probably, very significantly, changes in technology in the fishing industry began to have an effect. And the old ways that myself and John there and Pooch will remember as kids, those old ways would no longer sustain people. I mean, people are no longer happy to manage on, well, what would be an equivalent now of a £5 a week in the 1960s. That's what some of the fishermen were making in the late 1950s anyway, early 1960s, not much more than a £5 a week. But they led contented lives, and they didn't want or need the kinds of stuff that all of us sort of expect now. So it was inevitable that generation I suppose, was going to disappear. As the technology changed, as fishing methods changed, then, as I said earlier, the need for a harbour which could be used in all states at the tide became paramount, and most of it moved in Madagascar. The quay became a recurrent problem because the half-dozen fishermen who were still here in the 60s couldn't afford to keep it up. It got damaged from time to time. All sorts of complicated procedures were gone through, various grant-giving authorities were approached, and partial solutions were sorted out from time to time. Again, that's probably another evening. But in the end, Jim Liddycoat, Fred, was he still living? Yes, probably. Henry Johns, Lewis Billing, they said, we'll go and see the judge. Now, the judge was a barrister who later became Sir Hugh Park, had a cottage at the top of the street, which the family still owned. He'd been coming here since 1947, and he was a worldly wise kind of individual. He was heavily into fishing, very heavily into fishing. He had a small boat built about the size of, well, it's still here. Andy's got the same boat, isn't it? Yeah. The judge's boat in the harbour here now. Well, anyway, Sir Hugh Park, I think with Matt Brown, who some of you, Frank Brown, who some of you will recall, and Douglas Marr, constituted a successor to the Old Fishermen's Co-op, and that remains as the Goran Haven Harbour and Fishermen's Society Limited, and thank goodness it's in pretty good health. It's on a good legal footing, it has some income, so the quay is kept in good order. The last of the old generation of fishermen to retire was Lewis Billing, who retired in 1987. Now, there was a man who had been a full-time fisherman and nothing else for the whole of his life except for a brief period of war service. So he was the last of a kind, the last of hundreds, perhaps thousands of years of history. And we all thought, that's the end of that. It's just going to be a pleasure boating harbour, a bit of recreational fishing. And then, for my money, a small miracle happened. A number of young fellows around the village started getting licenses. And commercial fishing started again, restarted in this village after a few years. And I think that's so important because it gives such a dynamic and a sense of place and purpose and identity to the harbour. To know that it hasn't all gone down the tubes, that it hasn't all been taken over by tourism. So I'll just finish by saying I'm just thrilled to know that the fishing assets in Goran Haven are in great order, and we still have fishermen who go down to the sea in ships from hereabouts. Thank you.